Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Performance Quest with Francesco Cuzzolin. My name is Alessandro, and I'm one of the co-founders of Performance Lab. And I'm very happy to be here today with one of the most important strength conditioning coach and person in our field. With today, we start a series of podcasts, and I hope everyone will enjoy it. But just give me 2 minutes to let me thank you, Francesco, for have believed in us and start this new adventure with us. Thank you, Francesco. Well, Francesco has no need of presentation. He is one of the most important, as I said, strength conditioning coach. Has worked for NBA, Toronto Raptors. I've worked for Bologna, Treviso. Have had a lot of collaboration with teams and companies like Technogym, and now is the head of performance, director of performance of Treviso Basket. Here with Francesco, there is our guest of today, which is Marco Altini. Marco is a PhD in data science and computer science engineering, and now, he's the founder of Hacker Review for Training, HRV for Training, and guest lecturer at Vrije University Amsterdam. As I said, right? Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you very much. Francesco, if you want to say just 2 words, or we can
I
start.
just want to say hello, everybody. I'm really happy and excited for this experience for sure. And I don't like presentation because make me feel so old. And I want to keep believing that I'm still improving, not getting old. It's a completely different approach. But I'm really excited to have first guest Marco Altini. Marco is a very experienced guy in one of the hot topics, so I don't want to anticipate nothing about the topic for today. And starting this experience with Marco, it's in my opinion one of the best start that we could prepare. So thank you, Marco, for your availability and to be our guest for this podcast.
Thank you for having me. Really happy to be here tonight.
Well, okay, Marco, let's start and just explain us what is HRV and why it's so important in sport performance and health and fitness world.
So as HRV, we refer to basically the fact that the heart does not beat at a constant frequency. There is always some variation between beats. So in technical terms, we aim at quantifying that variation between beats. And that's important because basically it is our best proxy to stress and physiological stress. It's a non-invasive way to quantify how the nervous system basically responding to a stressor. So as we face stressors, which can come from many different sources, training as well as lifestyle, psychological stressors, physical stressors, all of that will have an impact in our physiology. And by monitoring heart rate variability, we can capture this response to the stressor. Which only means that our heart rate variability will reduce acutely in response to the stressor, as well as over longer periods of time in a chronic manner, so to speak, as we accumulate more stressors and might have issues dealing with that stress. That's also a form of stress that will result in reductions of HRV in a chronic way, and it's something that we can capture by monitoring heart rate variability. So that's why, in general, we think it's a very good marker variable to quantify, because it can give you insights into your response to stress.
So thank you for the introduction, because I think we're going to have a lot of coaches and experienced coaches in this specific topic. And I'm really curious about HRV, and I'm trying to understand how to apply this kind of measure on my training method. And my first question, considering also my experiences in the past, is which is the best modality to track the HRV how and when, because a lot of people are trying to push their own way of tracking HRV. So I want to know which is your experience and what you could advise to coaches when they got to take this number.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there's a lot out there, right? As you mentioned, many different tools and many different companies, and there is also a lot of research, like 50 years of papers published in the topic. And then one of the issues that comes up is that often there is a lot of inconsistency, right? So it's not that clear maybe what's the best way to capture data that then is going to be meaningful. And it's easy to get it wrong, maybe. So I think it's important to try to provide some guidelines there. And in my opinion, the best ways to do it are basically two. You can do either a measurement first thing in the morning. That's something that you can do in a very, let's say, repeatable context, which means that, every day it's the same. You're not affected by other stressors when you do it. And that's really the important bit, because, as soon as you drink coffee, you do some exercise, you will have an acute response, and then it does not make much sense to measure afterwards. And it doesn't mean that every stressor will have an effect that is negative, or that the problem there is simply that you don't want to measure right after that acute transitory effect that will just disappear in a few minutes. That is just gonna give you invalid data, basically. So first thing in the morning, as soon as you wake up, lying down in bed, that's certainly a good option. The other option is to measure throughout the night. So if you have a device that can track your HRV as you sleep, that's also a good method. There we have then another question, which is, some devices would give you maybe the lowest data point, or the highest data point, lowest maybe in terms of heart rate and highest in terms of HRV, or some would average maybe the first few hours of the night. I think first beat averages maybe between 1 and 4 a.m. Other devices like the Oura Ring would give you an average of the entire night. So as I looked a bit into all these methods, I think if you use all the data that you have, in this case, it gives you a bit of a better estimate of the body's response to stress. Because, as you sleep, you're unconscious, but at the same time, your HRV will depend on your sleep stage. So if you isolate certain periods of time, maybe you have isolated, one night, hours in which you were mostly in deep sleep, and another night, hours in which you were mostly in REM sleep, or you had poor sleep and you were
you're just anticipating my questions.
So then I think at that point, instead of cherry picking this specific point of the night, it's better to make use of the data, and as you average the whole night, your physiology will be reflective of the stressor. So I think it's a good idea at that point to use the whole night, or just a subset of it that is quite comprehensive still of the whole night. And I think those two options are pretty good and have been shown to be tightly linked to acute stressors such as hard sessions, lifestyle stressors, so to speak, alcohol intake, traveling, intercontinental travel, all of that, things that have an effect on your body. You can capture it in that way. So I would recommend these two methods.
So we can so just to summarize, just to wrap up few concepts, some bullet points for the coaches. The chronic measurement is very important because it's very important to understand which is the trend, I say. And the second one, the way you can match these measurements with your lifestyle. So it's very important. If you're just tracking heart rate variability by itself, it's a number that is not able to explain everything you can adjust on your lifestyle. So the real evaluation tracking is lifestyle and HRV. Are you agree on it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, when we measure physiology, if we do not contextualize it, then it's very difficult to implement changes because, we have a change in physiology, but what was, behind that change? So that's why we should, track things related to lifestyle as well as training load. And then we need to understand, what was leading a certain change. So, this metric is useful because it's not just training that will cause a change in HRV. I think that's eventually, maybe in the older days, people were criticizing the metric because, they were interested only in the training bit. But I think now it's more clear that you cannot just ignore stress. All the other stressors that are part of our life, they will have an impact. Lifestyle, the pandemic, it's not something that you can just say, yeah, this is not touching me. So if you have that impact in your physiology, then you have a metric that will capture that, and it will help you making some meaningful adjustments.
Now, this is a very important concept because it's difficult to explain to the coaches that also when they are training the physical, the cognitive, and the emotional aspect. So the same training with the coach that is screaming on you, that's not able to correct you in the right way, that's not able, to have a great relationship with you, is changing completely the emotional side. And in the team sports, for example, relationship that you can have with your teammates is completely different, or in a game where you have crowds and opponents or fans that can support you or can yell against you, is changing completely. So we cannot just speak about HRV and training load, because if you're not able to create a concept around, the measurement could be meaningless. So that's a very, very important aspect to underline. So another question that is, in my opinion, very important is what about normative values for HRV? How much individualized and specific they should be? Because coaches are always speaking with the numbers. They say if you're not able to measure something, it means that it has no any kind of value. So it's not always easy to find clear normative values about HRV, or something is changing in the last years?
Yeah, so this is very important because, the first step is, of course, to collect data at the right time, right? We talked about that. So you do that first and you start collecting data points. But then, once you have your scores, what do you do with that, right? So is that a good score or a bad score? So I think that when it comes to HRV, you really have to look only at the individual. So, you cannot even look at similar individuals, other athletes in the same sport, even in the same team. It doesn't mean much because what we are looking here is, at an individual's physiological stress, which again will depend to all sorts of things that are part of their life, but also of how, they live these relationships that you just mentioned, for example, all the psychological aspects. So the best way to make use of the data is, you collect the data daily, you start having a few weeks of data, and then, you know what is normal for this athlete, right? And that's when you start. So the first few weeks, collect some data, just look at, how things change for a person in response to various stressors. And then on a given day, then you will start finally be able to compare the daily score or the weekly average with this person's historical data. And then, when you see deviations from that, then it means there is something meaningful there. For example, a couple of days you have some scores that are lower than what this person usually have, that highlights much stress in that moment. And that, it's not something that you would be able to understand if you just measure those days, because you don't have context, you don't have historical data. So I think that's really important. It's a bit different from, other metrics where, you do a test maybe and you have a result which is already meaningful in the context of, normative values for athletes or things like that. But, when it comes to HRV, there is a lot of genetic components also in there. So you really want to collect some data and then start, checking how things deviate over time.
So let me bring you this example that could be interesting for many coaches that work in team sports, for example. They say that I want to provide this information to my players, and I'm tracking all their HRV with some technology. Your technology, for example, is very smart tool and very simple to be used in a team situation. I can collect, HRV, and they could be completely different. So I can have players that can manage stress in a good way, other players that could be at their edge, at their limit, to take a rest, for example. How you can manage the situation when you are working with a team, and there could be many differences that can come from their lifestyle, like you say, because training load could be a constant, so they're working together more or less, but outside the field, outside the floor, they could have a completely different scenario. How can I manage a situation like this?
Yeah, exactly. That's, I think it's one of the big challenges in, trying to use a tool that is super individualized in a team setting where, there are things that you do with all the team together. As you say, training can be similar and all of that. But I think there, it's important then to try really to work on the individual with small adjustments and, trying to figure out what could change inside, when you train together, small adjustments in training intensity and all of that that causes excessive stress, maybe in a period in which it's not the best timing. And then also try to work on, what happens outside, because that's also a very big component and, it cannot be ignored. And sometimes the data could help in that way because, maybe you just don't know anything about that, right? So you don't know what is happening. You just see your athletes and then they seem to be training okay. And then you have, a couple of days with values that clearly highlight that there are some important stressors. So it could be just a tool that at that point helps you starting a conversation with the athlete, right? And then from that you could try to work on that and see if there is something that can be improved.
I always prefer to know how my players are doing, before not knowing anything, and so making big mistakes. So you can avoid to make big mistakes if you got this information, because you can, like you say, you can make some small adjustments that can be very helpful. So next question is this one, because many coaches are scared about how to use HRV. So are we sure that having this information about the recovery cannot be a psychological boomerang for some athletes, because they scare, say, how I can talk with my coach and say, look, this guy in this situation needs some rest or needs just, to take a timeout.
Yeah, I agree. This is a difficult one because, it can have an impact, right? Anything that tells you something about how you're supposed to be feeling, your condition and everything, can have a psychological effect on the athlete. I think, first, I think it's important to talk and educate the athlete about, what is this about, right? So you're measuring stress, for example, and, sometimes your body is just, preparing for example, more sympathetic, for example, right? Preparing for a match, right? You're getting, really excited for the game and, your HRV could lower a bit. And that's totally normal, right? It's just a situation in which you are basically primed for action, right? So I think just by going over some of these things, it can be more clear that, a negative score, an isolated negative score is not necessarily a bad thing, and it does not mean that you cannot perform. At the same time, it could be that there is some psychological component there that is still a problem, right? So maybe you just don't want to see that on a day of, an important game or important match. So I think it's valuable still maybe to look at the data retrospectively, right? Because still you're going to play. But then you might want, to just hide the data on that day. For example, in our software, you have that option. So you measure, for example, a given day and you say in the questionnaire, okay, today is game day and, I don't want to see the score. And then you don't see it, but then you still have the data for later because, it can be still valuable just to see, for example, how were the players feeling or responding on the day of the important match or something like that. So I think there is also, room for sometimes collecting data without being totally transparent or looking at it, because it can have, depending on the person and the athlete and the situation, it can have the opposite effect as well, for sure.
What's happened to me that in some situation where the response was not so positive, let's say almost negative, the player was putting so much attention on his performance that performance was absolutely awesome. So because he felt himself like, okay, today I'm not 100%, I'm like 70%. I gotta be very focused on my performance, what I'm doing, because it will be easier for me to make mistakes. And what came out, he didn't make any kind of mistakes. He made a great game, So what the mind sometimes can cover in situation where your body or body and mind could be in trouble. We are a great capacity to adjust to stress. So knowing this number, in my opinion, and knowing which is the situation is absolutely important. We cannot avoid to track this number. So let's open a window on technology, because I would like to provide also some information. We have no sponsorship, So we have no any kind of conflict of interest. We can speak freely about what we believe is working and is worth having for coaches and athletes. So which is the state of the art of technology on measuring HRV so far?
All right. So, well, of course, we make a product. So I'm going to talk a little about that. So we build HRV for training, which is, at this stage, the only validated app that allows you to measure just with the phone, so with the camera, and you don't need any sensor. So that's the main advantage. And the fact that, the costs are reduced, it's easier for the athlete. And it's also the only one that has been actually validated against chest straps and ECG. So, it's a valid method. Then there are other apps that require, for example, external sensors like Elite HRV, which is certainly a good app. If you have sensors, the app is free. So then at that point, you can just try that out. For night measurements, I would recommend normally the Oura Ring. I used to recommend them even before starting working with them, which I do now. So I'm just going to disclose also that. But I think it's a great device. It's very user-friendly. You wear it during the night, collects high-quality data, and you can also pair it with our system so that you can read your night data in there and still get, the recommendations based on the analytics we described earlier, just interpreting your historical data and trying to figure out when you're more or less stressed with respect to your normal and all of that. So in general, I think these are very good options that, cover a broad range from free apps. Our app is $10 and Oura Ring, I think, is $300. So, depending on budget and all of that, you can also start easy and try to collect some data and see if that's something that is working out for you or for your athlete, and then get something else. But I think those are good solutions.
Absolutely. It doesn't need a huge investment. And I think athletes could provide this technology by themselves. So it's not necessary that the team has to provide this technology, because in any case are your information about your job, about what you're doing. So like you say, I'm fully agree that coaches should start with a small step, and after that, if they are able to manage all the new scenario and it is bringing results, they can make the next steps. So it's not something just unique for top organization, top teams, or the NBA, because now I saw that the Oura became like a sponsor to NBA and WNBA. So this kind of tool is becoming very, very famous, So, it's something that is not surprise me at all. So I'm pushing, I want to use you as much as possible because it's a big chance to share this topic with you. So another question is about, like I say, about a lifestyle. In my opinion, is a part of athletes, or a part of being athletes that we like coaches have underestimated for many, many years. So are you agree that HRV without a proper, well-set lifestyle hasn't the same value? And the next question is, new coaches or young coaches or coaches of the new generation must be life coaches before trainers?
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's everything we discussed today. I think it's pretty clear, right? You cannot just isolate one component. You cannot just think about training. Often other stressors will take over, and it's really important to look at all of that. And looking at HRV will give you a marker of stress that captures all of that. But then, of course, you need to be aware of where are the changes coming from. And again, you need to be aware of the lifestyle. You need to be able to try to work on that as well, not only on the training aspect. And I think, once you have all of that, then you start to have the full picture, as well as, subjective feeling of the athlete, right? There's, sometimes people get really polarized about this, use the technology, use the HRV, or you just use the subjective data, you just ask the athlete. You don't have to use one or the other, right? You can use both, right? You can ask the athlete how they feel, and you can track that, and you can also look at objective data and complement the two. I think those plus training load give you, the full picture, and then you can make smarter choices.
So we are always speaking about HRV to manage athletes' training load. But in the same team, there are coaches, there are staff. So what about them? Sometimes they are in a situation that they need to manage more stress than their athletes. I'm thinking about end of the season, lack of results, firing coaches or signing new players. Coaches are managing a lot of stress. What can we say about them?
Yeah, for sure. I think the same applies, right? So it's the same in the business world or in psychology research, where you don't even look at athletes, right? But you just look at how stress affects the body, and then they still use HRV as a way to capture that stressor and implement changes, as well as to do interventions like anything related to breathing and trying to improve your parasympathetic system, and all of that will have then an effect also on your HRV. So I think that the staff, the coach, as well as anyone else can use this tool to better manage stress regardless of training, despite the fact that normally we use it in training because the athletes are really the ones that are motivated to use this data to improve, always striving to improve, while for the others maybe you are less driven to try to look into these kind of things. But for sure there is value in there also for people other than athletes.
So you have mentioned breathing, for example. I'm thinking, can we provide a few advices on which are the, let's say, treatments or procedures or techniques that can be helpful for athletes and players to, let's say, to boost their HRV in somehow?
Yeah, I think first you always have to start with the basics, right? The basics of lifestyle, and get consistent high quality sleep, right? So without doing much else, I think there it's certainly key. And again, also anything related to diet, appropriate food intake for what is the demand of your sport. Try to reduce other stressors, and then you can also go for some specific protocols or interventions that aim at training again your parasympathetic system and improving your HRV. Things like biofeedback. Eventually it's deep breathing, just guided in a way that is maybe more fine-tuned to you, at a specific frequency of breathing. Things that you can also find out while using these tools that will teach you what's the best way to do it for yourself, and then take it from there to also improve basically your baseline and chronic values.
So once again, you got an holistic approach. There's not something that is working better. It has to be individualized. You got to test on yourself. You got to see how it's working or it's not working. So it's not, generally speaking, that we say breathing is a good technique for everybody, but the amount of benefit that you can bring is individualized, is subjective. Is not 100% sure. For sure, breathing is important. Activity that we can manage, we can adjust, but the results is absolutely subjective. And I think that you are agree with me on this.
Yeah, for sure. There is a lot of experimenting also, with individual athletes to figure out what works for them. I think there are always two aspects. One is just the assessment, right? You do the measurement so you understand, what's the situation with stress. So that's something that any coach can start doing. And then there is the difficult part, which is, how do you make changes to actually get better? And that's where you need to experiment a bit more and, find what works for your athlete.
So before you say that can happen that the athlete is managing stress because he's very close to big games, playoffs, So HRV that is getting higher, that is getting, like results is getting lower. So the results is not the best. Doesn't mean that the player is not in a situation that can perform in a proper way. So thinking about to manage, for example, a key moment of the season, when players are, playing for the next contract and playing for good results, what the coaches could expect in your experience, if you had this kind of experience.
I think that what we should not worry about is like the isolated low score, the acute response, and that's something that maybe is just a poor night of sleep. I think what we need to be more cautious about is when that happens more frequently. Like you have a couple of days in a row and your scores are always low, and then there might be something there. And that's when you might need, to make some adjustments also as a coach. Again, training intensity and reducing that is typically, the first thing to do. And yeah, because again, once you have that kind of chronic negative response, it could be anything, even just, now we have, in the context of the pandemic, an infection, for example, is something that, you'll see in your physiology, maybe a day or two before even you have other symptoms, right? Because your body is already fighting it, right? So your heart rate is raised, your HRV is reduced. So those kind of, data points can help you also identify potential issues there, which, can help, making adjustments again.
Did you find the differences between different sport disciplines, like in I don't know, cyclism, team sports, running, long distances? I know that you got a lot of data, that you have the possibility to provide some information about that.
Yeah, so normally we really try to advise always athletes to just look at how their data changes, with respect to their own history. So not necessarily comparing groups. I would say that, endurance athletes tend to have maybe slightly higher values of parasympathetic activity. But at the same time, even working with this data for many years, with many athletes of all different levels, I do not think that you have necessarily a strong link between even HRV and performance, even in endurance sports. I think, something like an association like you have even in resting heart rate. Typically you take top elite athletes in endurance sports will have a very low resting heart rate, others will have a much higher resting heart rate. We are not looking only at the elite, of course, because that's a very small range, but let's look at the population, right? But if you look at HRV, then you don't necessarily have that link, because I think it's really a metric of stress, something that you use at continuous feedback loop. So, continuously use the information to make changes, but it's not that you aim at the score. It's not that over the long term you want to get this particular value. What you want to do typically is to stay within that optimal range for you, and not to go outside of that very often, and not go below that very often. And of course, if you start from a poor situation, so to speak, you have poor lifestyle, and a person that maybe is a sedentary person, not an elite athlete, then of course you can also improve on your baseline value, right? Because there is so much you can do. Basically anything you would do would improve all your physiology, right? So also your HRV. But when you look at, in the context of elite athletes, I think typically we see higher values than the regular population. But then I think the main insight is really in the day-to-day stress management more than anything else.
So we're getting close to the end. Alessandro, sorry, do you have any question? Because
I would like to ask something, but very short question, I think. But it's a curiosity, of course, but I think it's interesting to go deeper. And we talk about lifestyle, we talk about wrong lifestyle, okay, and stressors that come from that. So of course. And how do you think? Well, in your experience, I think you can see in a very good way how much we lost in reliability of the data that we get from the athletes with the wrong lifestyle. And from the other side, maybe just look at that can help us to do something to let our athletes change. Maybe, I don't know, which is your position about?
I think that, if there are, let's say, inconsistencies, so to speak, right? So maybe athletes that, normally have a good behavior, but then sometimes they don't, then you would see in that data, on those days that something is off. And then, sometimes you could lose the ability to understand if that's a poor response to the training you provided and, to the training stimulus, or if, what's some other reason that caused, the dip, for example. one of the most obvious, strong links that we have is as simple as alcohol intake, right? If you have just a slightly higher than normal alcohol intake for one night, that is going to be reflected right away in your data. So, the data captures that, so it gives you useful information from that point of view, but then you lose basically the ability to capture the response to the training stimulus because you're confounding it with poor lifestyle choices. So I think that's always part of the picture. It's I would say you have the many sides of this because it's a metric that captures everything. So you need to work on the different aspects then to figure out what is causing dips or chronic changes.
So, Marco, amazing. I'm really, really happy for this huge amount of knowledge that your experience has provided to our podcast. So, I would like to close this first podcast with five, no more than 5 bullet points about HRV. And let's say that coaches want to start tracking HRV from where they should start, no more than 5. So squeeze your mind as much as possible, and let's start.
All right. So first I would say, get an app and start doing daily measurements every day. So that's the easiest part. And then I would say, just take a few weeks, ideally months, for, a phase in which you just collect data. You don't implement any changes. There's just awareness, basically.
Yeah.
At that point, I would say try to experiment a little. So, if you understand that an athlete has certain responses to something specific that maybe you're providing as a training stimulus or anything like that, try to see what changes you can implement to see if you can trigger a different response. And I would say these are just 3, but I think it's a good starting point, so we can summarize it even more for the coaches getting started with this.
It's absolutely, it's very important because I can't believe, like happened to me that at the beginning you want to start making changes, but you cannot change everything around your athletes. You got to be able to understand what is in your hands and what is not. So, like you say, like a wise and experienced sports scientist, to say, start tracking, start having your numbers, and after start, play with them, it's understanding how they can change, how they can move, and see how your athletes are responding. And if you can repeat the same situation one more time, because it doesn't mean that it worked one time and it's working always. It takes time. But once again, I'm playing with it from a few years, and HRV tracking has become one of the most important tracking in my opinion, because it's a data that is summarizing a lot of information. Yeah. So if you're able to give the real importance to this data, is something that is changing a lot of your training approach. And this is why I think coaches need more simple information. They need experience, like all the new things that are spinning around our world. But more than before in this period, it's very important if you got this help on your side, because it's in my opinion something that could be very important, making choices that can change performance and not just performance of your athletes. So thanks again, Marco. And it's been a very a brainstorming, very important for myself, and I think for all the coaches that will be our guests in our podcast. So I wish you all the best. I know that you're working in 2 continents, that I don't know how you are able to manage your stress, because working so hard, I think this is why you became an expert, because you are
exactly
so much stress on yourself that you became an expert, just because you have to save your life somehow.
I'm trying to find an answer exactly, but I don't have it yet.
Okay, no. I'm sure that you know how to manage yourself in the best way. So thank you again, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
Future.
To you as well. It was great being here and chatting about this. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, okay, just close this podcast, close this first for this first one. Thank you again, Marco. Thank you, Francesco. With Marco is a goodbye, but with Francesco, we're still going on looking for for our excellence. No, for we say we are looking for excellence, and we're still going on looking for it. So let me say goodbye from me and from all the Performance Lab staff. Thank you for being here at this Performance Quest. See you next time. Have a good night.